On the internet, there's a lot of online learning opportunities. One of them is referred to as a master class, where they've gone through and they found masters of particular disciplines, whether or not it's photographers or artists or chefs or writers or movie producers, and supposedly they give a mini-series, and it all sounds rather interesting to kind of learn from. One of them is the American astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. And in his advertisement, he mentions that there's a dilemma, a challenge to learning, where you know enough to know that you know something, but you don't know enough to know that you could perhaps be wrong. That kind of speaks to our old adage that you don't know what you don't know. We're conscious enough to know that we know something, but we're not conscious enough to know whether or not we know it correctly, or how much more that is out there that we don't know. There's no shame in being ignorant. However, if we pretend that we know something when in fact we don't, or whether or not we're convinced that we know something when we don't know it correctly, that's where the shame starts to come in. When we are arrogant, we believe that we're right, we jam it down other people's throats, and we don't realize that we're wrong, that's where the real shame starts to kick in. In this gospel passage, the disciples are turning to Jesus and suggesting that, okay, we're now convinced that you know enough. In our intellect, in our minds, we have understood enough that we believe that we have all the answers. We don't need to question you anymore about anything. We're no longer going to assume that you're wrong and question you till we're convinced that you're right. And so we're good, we're done. And Jesus points out that they are fooling themselves. That first off, faith isn't necessarily locked up with intellectual understanding. So even though that they may know something about who he is, they don't know everything about who he is. Their faith is going to be shaken because doubts always remain. Just because we know something doesn't mean that it can't be challenged. And so Jesus prophesies that when things get tough, his fair-weathered friends are going to go running for the hills in their fears, in their doubts. That in itself is not shameful. It's the fact that they were convinced that they had the answers where it becomes a problem. Peter himself makes a proper diagnosis that Jesus is the Son of God and then turns around and blows it by demonstrating how ignorant he is of what that actually means. Get behind me, Satan. John and James go looking to sit at the right and the left of Jesus. Can you drink of this cup that I'm going to drink? Oh, yes, we can. That's the correct answer, but they still don't know what it means, that cup is going to really challenge them. So the same is probably true for us in our lives of faith. We as a church proclaim, declare, dogmatize a lot of different things with rather great certitude that we have put God in a box of our understanding, that our theology has him nailed down. Even though we say God is a mystery, too much of our formational process is if we got answered. We have all the clues that God wouldn't allow us to be wrong by sending us the Holy Spirit to lead us all truth, that somehow we're infallible in our understanding of things. That attitude is problematic. We could be wrong and foolishly wrong, but also even if we're right, there's nothing wrong in allowing our truths to be further defined, to be challenged. One of the great noble professions in this life is that of a teacher. And if you have a teacher that is a know-it-all, odds are they're not the best of teachers. Because even if they have all the answers, that doesn't mean they're able to articulate them in a way that helps the students. A good teacher is a teacher that is humble enough, open enough, to try to see things from the perspective of the student. A good teacher understands what the student's hiccups and holdups are, where all their different misconceptions may be, and to sit with a student and find out where his or her personal misconceptions may be. Only when the teacher understands that can they then start to help the student overcome that ignorance, to become aware of how they're wrong, and to explore truth in a different perspective. So a good teacher is always a student themselves. They are learning more about the subject, as well as learning more how to express and articulate the truth to others. And that openness comes across as a certain level of humility, respect for the topic. Not to say that we got it all locked up, but to appreciate that there's ever increasing nuances to discover, to learn, to explore, to know the truth deeper for themselves, and to be able to help other people to do the same. So as we as people of faith just don't go off to our rooms and pray in private, as Jesus suggests, and certainly something that we're doing during this pandemic, we are supposed to be a communal people, meaning that the process of sharing our faith, teaching our faith, is a process ultimately about learning our faith ever more deeply. So let us all be students. Jesus says the Holy Spirit will be with us to lead us to all truth. That doesn't mean we get one master class that gets all the answers right up front. It means that we're constant, eternal students, learning Him ever more deeply about the truth of God. There is no shame in being ignorant. It's only shameful if we pretend that we have the answers, when in fact, we don't.